Another fraud case. Judge Raymond Caldwell flipped through the file folder with practiced disinterest. His clerk, Robert Sullivan, stood beside him in chambers, reviewing the day's docket on his tablet. Case number 2024 CR 4471. United States versus Isaiah Carter. Embezzlement. Government contractor. $500,000. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Another ghetto fraud case, Caldwell muttered, not looking up from the paperwork. They're getting bolder, stealing from federal contracts now. Sullivan's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. He'd only been clerking for Judge Caldwell for 6 months, fresh out of Yale Law, eager to learn from a federal judge with 20 years on the bench. But lately, comments like these made him uncomfortable. This was the third time this week Caldwell had made assumptions about defendants before even entering the courtroom. "The defendant has no prior record, Your Honor," Sullivan offered quietly, scanning his notes. "And according to the file, he's employed as an IT contractor." He laughed, sharp and dismissively. "They always have some cover story, Sullivan. Trust me, 20 years on this bench teaches you to read between the lines." He snapped the folder shut. "Let's get this over with. I have lunch at the Capitol Club at 1. In the holding area adjacent to Courtroom 6, Isaiah Carter sat with his hands clasped in his lap. The cheap suit he wore pulled slightly at the shoulders, deliberately purchased one size too small from a discount retailer in Southeast D.C. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Around him, other defendants shifted nervously, whispering with their attorneys, checking phones, adjusting ties with trembling fingers. Isaiah remained perfectly still. His mother's face flickered through his mind. Lorraine Carter, public defender, warrior for the voiceless. She had died at 53, her heart giving out after a particularly brutal week defending clients in this very courthouse. She could still hear her voice from that last phone call, exhausted but determined. "Baby, the system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed, and that's what makes it so hard to fix." 18 months. 18 months of building this cover identity. 18 months of missing his daughter's soccer games and ballet recitals. 18 months of lying to his wife Sarah about extended FBI assignments while he lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Anacostia, establishing his identity as Isaiah Carter, struggling IT contractor with financial problems and big dreams. The bathroom door opened. Isaiah glanced up briefly, noting the federal marshal who entered and scanned the room with professional detachment. Deputy U.S. Marshal James Whitfield, 18 years of service, decorated veteran, clean record, and according to the background investigation Isaiah had personally reviewed, a good man trapped in a system that punished those who spoke up. "Carter," a bailiff called from the doorway, "you're up next. Get ready." Isaiah stood slowly, smoothing his ill-fitting jacket. His phone buzzed in his pocket. One coded message from Victoria Cross, his second in command. "All systems go. Target confident. Make it count." He breathed deeply. Today, his mother would get the justice the system had denied her. The courtroom was filling when Isaiah entered. The E. Barrett Prettyman Federal Courthouse, named after a judge who had championed civil rights, now housed the very corruption it was supposed to prevent. The irony wasn't lost on him. Journalist Aisha Kamal settled into the third row of the gallery, her leather notebook already open, pen poised. Something about this case felt different. She'd been tracking Judge Caldwell's sentencing patterns for 2 years, noticing disturbing trends. Black defendants received harsher sentences than white defendants for identical crimes. The data was undeniable. But proving judicial bias was nearly impossible without a smoking gun. Maybe today would give her that gun. Court reporter Diane Chen positioned herself at her stenography machine with unusual precision. To any observer, she appeared to be a timid Asian woman in her 40s, diligent and invisible. No one noticed when her fingers tapped a specific sequence on her keyboard, sending a coded signal to the surveillance team positioned in the federal building across the street. The system was live. Every word would be recorded, every gesture documented, every moment of corruption preserved for posterity. At the prosecution table, Special Agent Monica Reeves organized her files with meticulous care. She wore a Navy suit that screamed federal prosecutor, conservative, expensive, authoritative. Her credentials identified her as Assistant U.S. Attorney Monica Reeves. The credentials were real. Everything else about her role today was theater. She glanced across the aisle at Marcus Holloway, Isaiah's court-appointed public defender. He was shuffling papers nervously, dropping a pen, looking every bit the overwhelmed and underprepared attorney. Marcus caught her eye for just a briefest second. The briefest acknowledgement between two federal agents about to commit to the performance of their lives. Monica felt the weight of what they were doing settle in her chest. She would spend the next 2 days verbally destroying an innocent man, her boss, her mentor, the FBI director who had personally selected her for this operation because of her brother Jerome, who served 6 years for a crime he didn't commit before DNA evidence finally freed him. This was personal for all of them.
All rise. The bailiff's voice cut through the courtroom murmur. Everyone stood as Judge Raymond Caldwell entered through his private door, black robe flowing, expression stern and controlled. He took his seat on the bench with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Caldwell's eyes swept the courtroom and landed on Isaiah at the defense table. For just a moment, something flickered across the judge's face. Contempt, disgust, the look of a man seeing exactly what he expected to see. In the gallery, elderly Thomas Watkins leaned toward the young man beside him, a first-time offender facing drug charges. Thomas had seen this pattern before. He was 72 years old, a veteran of the civil rights movement, now facing charges for growing medical marijuana for his dying wife. He'd been through Caldwell's courtroom twice before. "I've seen this judge before," Thomas whispered, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "He's bad news for people who look like us." Marshal Whitfield stood by the door, hands clasped behind his back, face carefully neutral, but his jaw tightened as he watched Caldwell's eyes linger with Isaiah with undisguised judgment. Whitfield had witnessed this dozens of times, the subtle and not-so-subtle ways Caldwell treated black defendants differently. The harsher bail conditions, the skepticism toward character witnesses, the maximum sentences where minimums would suffice. He'd never reported it. Who would he report it to? Caldwell had friends in high places. Judges protected judges. The system protected its own. United States versus Isaiah Carter, case number 2024 CR 4471, the clerk announced. Isaiah stood, straightening his jacket with deliberate care. His face settled into a mask of calculated humility. Respectful but not servile. Dignified but not defiant. The mask he'd perfected over 18 months of preparation. Judge Caldwell leaned back in his chair, studying Isaiah like a specimen under glass. "Here we go," the judge said, his tone already dismissive. "Let's see what we have here." The trial was about to begin, and with it, Judge Raymond Caldwell's carefully constructed world would start its slow, inevitable collapse. Monica Reeves rose from the prosecution table with fluid confidence. Every eye in the courtroom tracked her movement as she approached the jury box. There was no jury. Judge Caldwell had insisted on a bench trial, claiming the complexity of financial crimes required judicial expertise rather than lay judgment. This suited the FBI perfectly. Everything Caldwell said and did would be on the record, unfiltered by jury deliberation. "Your Honor," Monica began, her voice carrying the righteous authority of the United States government. "The evidence in this case will demonstrate a pattern of calculated theft, sophisticated deception, and brazen criminality. Isaiah Carter, the defendant seated before you, systematically embezzled over $500,000 from Patterson Defense Systems, a government contractor providing critical services to the Department of Defense." She walked slowly toward the defense table, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Isaiah kept his eyes forward, his expression neutral. Only Diane Chen, fingers flying across her stenography machine, noticed the microscopic tension in his jaw. The evidence will show, Monica continued, that the defendant lived far beyond his means. Designer clothes, expensive electronics, a lifestyle inconsistent with his reported income as an IT contractor. She paused for effect, because that income was supplemented by theft. Herr Caldwell nodded approvingly, already engaged with the narrative. This was the kind of case he enjoyed. Clear wrongdoing, obvious guilt, an opportunity to deliver justice and reinforce social order. Monica returned to her table and sat down, satisfied. The opening statement had been flawless. Every word designed to sound convincing while planting evidence that would later exonerate Isaiah when the truth emerged. "Mr. Holloway," Judge Caldwell's voice carried barely concealed skepticism, "does the defense have an opening statement?" Marcus Holloway stood awkwardly, nearly knocking over his water glass. Papers scattered from his folder as he fumbled with his notes. Several people in the gallery exchanged glances. Thomas Watkins shook his head sadly, recognizing incompetence when he saw it. Yes, Your Honor, thank you. My client, Mr. Carter, he maintains his innocence in this matter. The prosecution will attempt to show evidence of, that is to say, to show evidence of... He trailed off, rifling through his papers as if searching for a specific document. Judge Caldwell's expression shifted from skepticism to open disdain. "Mr. Holloway, are you prepared to proceed?" "Yes, Your Honor, absolutely. I'm sorry." He found a page and held it up, squinting at it. "The defense will demonstrate that there are extenuating circumstances and reasonable doubt about the provenance of these allegations."
Marshal Whitfield shifted uncomfortably by the door. This was painful to watch. The defendant deserved better representation than this stammering public defender who could barely string together a coherent sentence. "Provenance?" Judge Caldwell interrupted, his voice sharp. "Mr. Holloway, provenance refers to the origin of an object, typically artwork. I believe you mean veracity or validity." Laughter rippled through the gallery. Marcus's face flushed red. "Right, yes, Your Honor. Veracity. Thank you for the correction." He shuffled his papers again. "What I meant to say is that the defense will show that my client is not guilty of these crimes because he didn't do them, and we'll prove that through evidence and testimony." Even Sullivan winced from his seat beside the judge's bench. He made a note. "Defense counsel severely unprepared. Possible grounds for ineffective assistance if case is appealed." Caldwell waved his hand dismissively. "Is that all, Mr. Holloway?" "Yes, Your Honor. We rest our opening statement." "You rest your opening statement?" Caldwell's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Holloway, you don't rest an opening statement. You conclude it. Please sit down before you further embarrass yourself and your client." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Monica watched Marcus shuffle back to his seat, and she felt a pang of guilt despite knowing this was all performance. They were deliberately making Isaiah look abandoned by the system, represented by an incompetent attorney who couldn't even deliver a basic opening statement. This would make Caldwell's eventual bias appear even more egregious. But it still hurt to watch. "The prosecution may call its first witness," Caldwell announced, settling back into his chair with the satisfied expression of a man watching a foregone conclusion unfold. "The United States calls Special Agent Timothy Morrison, forensic accountant with the FBI." A man in his 50s walked to the witness stand, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth. Agent Morrison was, in fact, a real FBI forensic accountant, but the evidence he was about to present was entirely fabricated, created specifically for this operation. Monica approached the witness stand with her notes. "Agent Morrison, can you explain your role in investigating the financial crimes in this case?" "Yes, ma'am.
I was assigned to trace the flow of funds from Patterson Defense Systems to identify any irregularities or fraudulent transactions. And what did you discover? Morrison pulled out a folder and extracted several documents. I identified 23 separate wire transfers totaling $547,000 that were sent from Patterson Defense to 3 shell companies controlled by the defendant, Isaiah Carter. Caldwell leaned forward with interest. 3 shell companies. Elaborate, please. Monica smiled inwardly. Caldwell was already going beyond the standard judicial role, showing active engagement with the prosecution's case. Diane Chen's fingers never stopped moving, documenting every word, every inflection. Morrison detailed the fabricated evidence with impressive precision. Bank statements showing transfers, corporate filings listing Isaiah as the registered agent, email correspondence appearing to show him authorizing fraudulent invoices. Every piece of evidence had been meticulously created by the FBI's cyber division. And could these transfers have been authorized by anyone other than the defendant? Highly unlikely. The digital signatures match his login credentials, the IP addresses traced to his home and workplace. The timing of transactions corresponds with his work schedule. Isaiah sat perfectly still, watching this fictional version of himself being constructed. Marcus beside him took notes that consisted mainly of doodles and barely legible scribbles. "No further questions," Monica said, returning to her seat. Judge Caldwell turned to Marcus. "Mr. Holloway, your witness." Marcus stood, approaching the witness stand with his legal pad. He glanced at his notes, then at the witness, then back at his notes. "Agent Morrison, you said you found 23 transfers." "That's correct." "And those transfers totaled how much again?" Morrison glanced at his report. $547,000. Marcus wrote this down slowly, as if it were a profound revelation. Several people in the gallery exchanged bewildered looks. "And these shell companies, they were created by my client?" "According to the corporate filings, yes." "I see." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as though this was new information. "No further questions." Judge Caldwell stared at Marcus with undisguised contempt. "That's your cross-examination? You essentially just had the witness repeat his direct testimony." "I was establishing the facts, Your Honor." "The facts were already established during direct examination. Cross-examination is where you challenge the witness's testimony, question their methodology, probe for weaknesses." His voice rose slightly. "Did you even graduate from law school?" "Yes, Your Honor, I graduated from—" It was a rhetorical question. "Sit down." Thomas Watkins gripped the bench in front of him, his knuckles white. He'd seen this before. The judge humiliating defense attorneys, undermining their credibility, ensuring defendants got inadequate representation. But this was worse than usual. This felt personal. "Your Honor," Marcus said quietly, returning to his seat, "I object to—"
Object to what, Mr. Holloway? To me pointing out that you're providing ineffective counsel? Your client is facing serious federal charges, and you're bumbling through this trial like a first-year law student. Caldwell leaned forward, his voice carrying across the courtroom. "Mr. Carter, did you even want a lawyer, or did you just pick someone random off the street?" Isaiah looked up slowly, meeting Caldwell's gaze. "The court appointed Mr. Holloway, Your Honor. I'm grateful for his representation." His voice was measured, respectful, carefully neutral. But Caldwell heard something else. Dignity, composure, the quiet strength of someone who refused to be broken. It irritated him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. "Grateful?" Caldwell scoffed. "You should be demanding new counsel. But then again, given the evidence against you, I'm not sure even a competent attorney could help." He turned back to Monica. "Does the prosecution have additional witnesses?" "Yes, Your Honor. The United States calls Jennifer Patterson, CFO of Patterson Defense Systems."
As the witness was sworn in, Diane Chen's hands trembled slightly on her stenography machine. She'd been documenting judicial misconduct for 12 years, but watching Caldwell systematically humiliate both defendant and counsel in real time made her professional detachment crack. She took a breath and continued typing, her screen filled with coded timestamps marking each inappropriate comment. Caldwell wasn't just biased. He was creating a textbook case of judicial misconduct, one documented statement at a time. And he had no idea he was building his own prison. The lunch recess came like a temporary reprieve from a boxing match. The courtroom emptied slowly, spectators filing into the hallway, attorneys gathering their materials, court staff disappearing to their private spaces. Isaiah remained at the defense table for a moment after Marcus left, his head bowed as if in prayer or defeat. Only when the courtroom was nearly empty did he rise and walk toward the bathroom, his cheap suit jacket hanging awkwardly on his frame. In the courthouse cafeteria, Aisha Kamal spotted Thomas Watkins sitting alone at a corner table, his tray of food untouched. She'd learned to trust her instincts over 15 years of investigative journalism. This man had a story to tell. "Excuse me," she said, approaching his table. "I'm Aisha Kamal with the Washington Post. I've been covering judicial proceedings in this courthouse. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?" Thomas looked up, his eyes carrying the weariness of someone who'd seen too much injustice. "About that trial? About Judge Caldwell?" "Both." Aisha sat down without waiting for permission, pulling out her notebook. "You seem familiar with Judge Caldwell's courtroom." Thomas laughed bitterly. "Familiar? I've been through his courtroom twice before. Got my own case with him next week." He gestured toward the hallway leading back to courtroom 6. "That young man in there, Carter, he doesn't stand a chance. Not with Caldwell, not with that lawyer. The system breaks people who can't afford to fight back." Aisha's pen moved across her notepad. "Can you elaborate? What have you witnessed in Judge Caldwell's courtroom?" "What haven't I witnessed?" Thomas shook his head. "I watched him give a white corporate executive probation for stealing $2 million from his company. Tax fraud, they called it. 3 months later, I watched him give a black kid 10 years for selling marijuana. 10 years for pot, 3 months probation for $2 million. He met Aisha's eyes directly. "You do the math." "And the Carter case?" "That judge made up his mind before the trial even started. You could see it in his face, the way he looks at that young man like he's already guilty, already beneath him, like he's—" Thomas paused, searching for the right words. "Like he's not even human, just another case number, another black face in a long line of black faces he's sent away." Aisha wrote quickly, her mind already composing the article. She had statistics on Caldwell's sentencing disparities, but personal testimony like this added the human element that made stories resonate. "Can I quote you?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yeah, quote me. I'm 72 years old and facing charges for trying to keep my dying wife comfortable. What else can they do to me?" 3 floors above, in Judge Caldwell's chambers, Robert Sullivan spread his notes across the conference table. The courtroom transcript from the morning session lay beside him, along with the prosecution's evidence exhibits. He was supposed to be preparing notes for the afternoon session, but something nagged at him. The bank records. He pulled them closer, studying the dates and serial numbers on the wire transfer documentation. His undergraduate degree was in accounting before he went to law school. Numbers told stories if you knew how to read them. The serial numbers on some of these documents didn't match their dates. Bank transaction confirmations had serial numbers that followed sequential patterns based on when they were issued. But several of these documents showed serial numbers from different time periods than their stated dates. Sullivan frowned. This could be a clerical error. Banks make mistakes. Documents get misfiled. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. But it could mean everything. He pulled out his laptop and started searching for articles about document fraud, forensic accounting, fabricated evidence. His stomach turned as he read about innocent people convicted on fabricated documentation.
No, he was being paranoid. This was a federal prosecution. The FBI didn't manufacture evidence. Agent Morrison was a decorated forensic accountant. The U.S. Attorney's Office had reviewed this case. Sullivan closed his laptop and gathered the documents. He placed them back in their folders, but he couldn't quite suppress the doubt gnawing at his conscience. He made a note in his personal journal. Discrepancies in bank records. Review later. Then he filed the journal in his briefcase instead of leaving it on Caldwell's desk. In the third-floor men's bathroom, Isaiah Carter stood at the sink, gripping the porcelain edge with both hands. His reflection stared back at him, a man playing a role so convincingly that sometimes he forgot who he really was. The cheap suit, the submissive posture, the mask of respectful defeat. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, checking the coded message from Victoria Cross. Performance excellent, target taking the bait. Stay strong. Stay strong. He'd been strong for 18 months, strong through missing his daughter's birthdays, strong through lying to his wife every day, strong through becoming someone else, living in a neighborhood where he didn't belong, working a job that didn't challenge him, building a fictional life so detailed it sometimes felt more real than his actual one. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. "Baby, sometimes you have to walk through fire to burn down what's wrong." He was walking through fire, and soon that fire would consume Raymond Caldwell. Isaiah splashed cold water on his face, straightened his tie, and put the mask back on. 2 more days. He could endure 2 more days of humiliation, because when this was over, when Caldwell's corruption was exposed for the world to see, every moment of degradation would be worth it. In the parking garage beneath the federal courthouse, Judge Raymond Caldwell met with Gerald Hutchins beside a concrete pillar marked B7. Hutchins was a lobbyist for several private prison corporations, a man who made his living ensuring that incarceration remained profitable. "The Henderson case," Hutchins said quietly, handing Caldwell an envelope. "Sentencing is next month. My clients are very interested in the outcome." Caldwell took the envelope without looking inside. He knew what it contained. $25,000 in cash, untraceable, payment for ensuring that Michael Henderson received the maximum sentence for his drug conviction. Henderson was black, 23 years old, first-time offender. Under federal sentencing guidelines, he could receive anywhere from 5 to 15 years. Caldwell would give him 15. "Henderson's getting what he deserves. These people need to learn that actions have consequences. My clients appreciate your commitment to law and order, Judge." What neither man noticed was Deputy Marshal James Whitfield, standing in the stairwell 40 feet away, watching through the small window in the fire door. Whitfield's hand moved to his radio, then stopped. Who would he call? What would he report? That he saw a judge talking to someone in a parking garage? Whitfield had seen this dance before. The quiet meetings, the envelopes, the patterns of harsh sentences that benefited private prisons. But he'd never had proof. And without proof, accusations meant the end of his career. He turned away from the window and walked back up the stairs, the weight of his silence pressing down like a physical burden. Across the street from the courthouse, in a nondescript federal building, Special Agent Monica Reeves sat in a secure room surrounded by monitors. Video feeds showed multiple angles of the courthouse: exterior, hallways, courtroom, parking garage. She watched the feed from the parking garage, saw Caldwell accept the envelope from Hutchins. "Got it," said the surveillance tech sitting beside her. "Clear video, good audio. That's number 23. Monica felt no satisfaction. Each bribe they documented was another victim of Caldwell's corruption, another family destroyed, another life shattered for profit. Her phone rang.
Marcus Holloway. "How's Isaiah holding up?" she asked without preamble. "He's solid, but Caldwell's getting aggressive faster than we anticipated. The afternoon session could get ugly." "Let it get ugly. The worse Caldwell behaves, the stronger our case." Monica paused. "But Marcus, if you think Isaiah's in actual danger, psychologically or otherwise, you call it. We pull the plug." "I know, but he won't let us pull the plug. You know that." Monica did know that. Isaiah Carter had spent 3 years planning this operation. He'd sacrificed 18 months of his life, his relationship with his family, his peace of mind. He wouldn't stop until Caldwell's corruption was exposed in the most public, undeniable way possible. In the courthouse hallway, Isaiah and Marcus passed each other without acknowledgement. Marcus walked towards the cafeteria, heading for coffee. Isaiah moved toward the courtroom, ready for the afternoon session. Their paths didn't cross, their eyes didn't meet, but in that brief moment of proximity, Marcus whispered 2 words: "Almost there." Isaiah didn't need to. They were all almost there. Almost to the moment when the mask would drop. Almost to the moment when Judge Raymond Caldwell would discover that he'd picked the wrong defendant, the wrong case, the wrong day to let his corruption run unchecked. Almost there. The afternoon session would begin in 15 minutes, and with it, the cracks in Caldwell's facade would widen into chasms.
The afternoon session began with a character witness. Monica Reeves called Patricia Hendricks, a fabricated co-worker from Patterson Defense Systems, played by another undercover FBI agent. Patricia testified that Isaiah always seemed to be living beyond his means. "He wore expensive watches," Patricia said, her voice dripping with judgment. "Designer suits. He drove a BMW, and he was always talking about his investment portfolio, about making it big, getting rich quick." Judge Caldwell leaned forward with interest. "Did he discuss specific investment strategies?" Monica smiled internally. Caldwell was doing her job for her, leading the witness with his own questions. "Not really strategies, Your Honor. More like schemes, get-rich-quick ideas. Cryptocurrency, day trading. He seemed obsessed with money." Marcus Holloway stood for cross-examination, fumbling with his notes. "Ms. Hendricks, you said my client wore expensive watches?" "Yes." "And you know they were expensive? How?" Patricia shrugged. "They looked expensive." Marcus nodded slowly, as this were profound testimony. "So you don't actually know if they were expensive. You just assumed." "I suppose." No further questions. Judge Caldwell stared at Marcus with undisguised contempt. "Mr. Holloway, that was possibly the weakest cross-examination I've witnessed in 20 years on this bench. You had an opportunity to establish that the witness was speculating, that she had no actual knowledge of your client's finances, that her testimony was based entirely on assumptions and prejudice." His voice rose. "Instead, you asked one question and sat down like you were afraid of her." Marcus's face flushed. "Your Honor, don't interrupt me when I'm speaking to you." Caldwell's eyes flashed with anger. "Your client is facing 15 years in federal prison, and you're providing the legal equivalent of a wet paper bag for defense. Did you even graduate from law school, or did you buy your degree from some diploma mill?" Aisha Kamal's pen flew across her notepad. This was extraordinary. Judges disciplined attorneys privately, not in open court. This public humiliation served no legal purpose. "Your Honor," Marcus said quietly, "I graduated from Georgetown Law." "Georgetown?" Caldwell laughed sharply. "Then someone at Georgetown needs to ask for their degree back, because you clearly learned nothing about trial advocacy." In the gallery, Thomas Watkins half rose from his seat. "This ain't right." Deputy Marshal Whitfield moved quickly, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Sir, please sit down," he said, his voice lacking conviction. Whitfield's jaw was tight and his eyes troubled. He'd seen Caldwell's bias before, but never this blatant, this cruel. Thomas sat,
but spoke loud enough for the courtroom to hear. That judge made up his mind before this trial even started. "Mr. Watkins, one more outburst and I'll hold you in contempt," Caldwell warned. "Marshal Whitfield, if he speaks again, remove him from the courtroom." "Yes, Your Honor," Whitfield said, but he whispered to Thomas, "I'm sorry." Isaiah sat perfectly still at the defense table, his hands folded, his face a mask of controlled dignity. But Diane Chen, documenting every word, noticed his jaw clench briefly when Caldwell attacked Marcus. She typed a coded signal. Subject showing stress, but maintaining. Monica called 2 more witnesses, building the fabricated case brick by brick. Each time Marcus cross-examined, Caldwell found new ways to mock his competence. The judge's comments grew increasingly personal, increasingly focused not just on Marcus's legal skills, but on his intelligence, his education, his worth as a human being. And then Caldwell turned his attention to Isaiah. "Mr. Carter," Caldwell said during a break in testimony, "stand up." Isaiah stood slowly, maintaining eye contact with the judge. "Speak up when I address you. Don't mumble like a street thug." "I haven't said anything yet, Your Honor," Isaiah replied in his normal voice, clear, articulate, professional. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "Don't get smart with me. I've seen your type before, thinking you can talk your way out of anything, thinking rules don't apply to you." Robert Sullivan, sitting beside the bench, passed a note to Caldwell. "Your Honor, recommend recess. Comments approaching reversible error." Caldwell crumpled the note without reading it fully. "Your Honor," Marcus stood, "I object to your characterization of my client. Overruled. Sit down, Mr. Holloway, before I hold you in contempt for wasting this court's time." Monica made brief eye contact with Isaiah. Just a fraction of a second, but enough to convey concern. "Are you okay? Can you hold on?" Isaiah's almost imperceptible nod was his only response. Diane Chen's hands actually shook as she transcribed Caldwell's latest comments. 12 years documenting judicial proceedings, and she'd never witnessed anything this egregious. Her professional detachment was cracking, but she kept typing, kept recording, kept building the unimpeachable record that would end Caldwell's career. Aisha suddenly stood, gathering her notebook. She needed to call her editor immediately. This wasn't just a story about sentencing disparities anymore. This was about judicial misconduct happening in real time, in open court, witnessed by dozens of people. She rushed from the courtroom, already dialing. "Your Honor," Caldwell announced, checking his watch, "I've heard enough testimony. I expect closing arguments tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. He paused, his eyes fixed on Isaiah. "And I want to be clear. I've already made up my mind about this case. The evidence is overwhelming. The defendant is guilty, and he will be sentenced accordingly." Even Sullivan looked shocked. Judges weren't supposed to announce predetermined verdicts before closing arguments. This was grounds for immediate appeal, possibly even grounds for mistrial.
"Your Honor," Marcus said carefully, "with respect, announcing a predetermined verdict before the defense has presented its case—" "The defense?" Caldwell laughed. "Mr. Holloway, you haven't presented a defense. You've presented a series of incompetent cross-examinations and bumbling objections. Your client would have been better off representing himself." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Even the spectators who knew nothing about legal procedure understood they were witnessing something wrong, something that crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning," Caldwell announced, standing. "Mr. Carter, enjoy your freedom while it lasts. Tomorrow, justice will be served." As Caldwell disappeared through his private door, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Thomas Watkins shook his head, tears of anger in his eyes. Whitfield stood frozen by the door, his hand clenched around his radio, wanting to intervene, but paralyzed by the knowledge that the system protected judges, not defendants. Isaiah remained seated, his head bowed, the picture of defeated dignity. But in his pocket, his phone buzzed with a coded message from Victoria Cross. "Tomorrow.
Be ready. Tomorrow the performance would end. Tomorrow, Raymond Caldwell would learn that he'd picked the wrong defendant to humiliate. Tomorrow, justice, real justice, would finally come to courtroom 6. Isaiah Carter sat alone in his studio apartment in Anacostia, surrounded by the carefully constructed fiction of his cover identity: cheap furniture from discount stores, a laptop with a cracked screen, framed photos of people he'd never met, purchased from thrift stores to make the apartment look lived in. 18 months of pretending to be someone else had made the pretense feel almost real. His phone sat on the table, dark and silent. He wanted to call Sarah, to hear his daughter's voices, to connect with the life he had abandoned for this operation. But operational security meant maintaining the cover until the very end. One phone call could compromise everything. Instead, he opened a classified file on his encrypted tablet, photos of defendants who had appeared before Judge Raymond Caldwell over the past 8 years. Their faces told stories of injustice, harsh sentences, families destroyed, lives shattered by a corrupt system that protected its own. One file made him pause. Marcus Williams, age 19, first-time offense, possession with intent to distribute. Sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Marcus had been a college student with no prior record. A white defendant charged with the identical crime had received probation. Marcus Williams had hanged himself in his cell after 6 months. Isaiah closed his eyes, grief and rage warring in his chest. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. "Baby, sometimes you have to walk through fire to burn down what's wrong." Tomorrow he would burn down what was wrong. Across the city, in a secure FBI facility, Monica Reeves sat across from Victoria Cross in a windowless conference room. Case files covered the table between them, evidence of Caldwell's corruption spanning 8 years. "We have enough," Victoria said firmly. 23 documented bribes, 47 cases of dismissed prosecutorial misconduct, statistical evidence of racial bias. "We can arrest him tonight." Monica shook her head. "Isaiah wants Caldwell's reaction on record. He wants the moment when Caldwell realizes he destroyed himself. And how much more abuse can Isaiah take? Did you see him today? Did you watch Caldwell systematically dehumanize him in open court?" "I watched every second, and it made me sick. But Isaiah's right. We need Caldwell to sentence him. We need the judge to commit the final act that demonstrates his complete disregard for justice." Victoria leaned back in her chair. "This operation has consumed 3 years of planning and 18 months of execution. We've asked Isaiah to sacrifice his relationship with his family, his peace of mind, his dignity. At some point, Monica, we have to consider whether the cost is worth it." "Isaiah believes it's worth it, and I trust his judgment. I selected Isaiah for director because of his judgment, but I also selected him because of his mother, because of what this system did to her. And I worry that his motivation is revenge, not justice." Monica met Victoria's eyes. "Can't it be both?" In a modest home in Silver Spring, Marcus Holloway sat at his parents' kitchen table. His father, a civil rights attorney, reviewed case files for an upcoming trial. His mother, who ran a legal aid clinic, prepared dinner. "How's work, Marcus?" his father asked without looking up. Marcus couldn't tell them he was an undercover FBI agent. They believed he worked as a public defender, which, in a sense, was true for this operation. "Tough case," Marcus said. "Judge is difficult." His mother glanced over from the stove. "Caldwell?" Marcus's head snapped up. "How did you know?" "Your father has a client with sentencing next month. Caldwell's court." She shook her head. "That judge has been a plague on the justice system for years. Everyone knows it. No one does anything about it."
His father closed his file. "I had a client last year. Black kid, 23, first offense, drug possession. Caldwell gave him 20 years. 20 years for a first offense when the sentencing guidelines suggested 5. Meanwhile, a white executive who embezzled $2 million received probation." Marcus felt the weight of what they were doing settle more heavily. This wasn't just about catching one corrupt judge. This was about exposing a pattern that everyone knew existed, but no one could prove.
Tomorrow, they would prove it. In her Georgetown apartment, Aisha Kamal surrounded herself with spreadsheets and documents. Her laptop displayed sentencing data spanning Caldwell's entire career. The pattern was undeniable. Black defendants received sentences averaging 3.7 years longer than white defendants for identical crimes. She'd created data visualizations showing the disparity, charts, graphs, statistical analyses that any reasonable person would recognize as evidence of systemic bias. Her editor had called twice already. "This is front-page material, Aisha, but we need to be absolutely certain. One mistake and Caldwell sues us into oblivion." "I'm certain," she'd replied. "The data doesn't lie." But as she reviewed the Carter case, something nagged at her. The evidence seemed too perfect, the prosecution's case too airtight, the defense's too incompetent. It felt staged. She couldn't prove it. She had no evidence, just the instincts developed over 15 years of investigative journalism that told her something was wrong with this picture. She made a note in her file. "Follow-up post-trial. Something doesn't add up." In Caldwell's chambers, Robert Sullivan worked late, unable to shake his growing doubts. The bank records with inconsistent serial numbers, the witnesses whose testimony seemed too polished, the defendant whose calm dignity seemed inconsistent with the profile of a desperate embezzler. He pulled out his personal journal and wrote, "Day 2 of trial. Judge's behavior increasingly concerning. Public humiliation of defense counsel. Predetermined verdict announced before closing arguments. This case will be reversed on appeal." Then he added, "Evidence inconsistencies unresolved. Request separate investigation?" But he knew he wouldn't submit that request. Requesting an investigation of evidence in a case your judge was presiding over was career suicide. Sullivan had ambitions, clerkships with appellate courts, eventually a partnership at a prestigious firm. Questioning a federal judge's case would destroy those ambitions. He closed the journal and placed it in his briefcase. Tomorrow, after sentencing, he would decide what to do. At an expensive steakhouse in downtown Washington, Judge Raymond Caldwell dined with 3 other federal judges. They congratulated him on his tough sentencing record, his commitment to law and order, his willingness to hold criminals accountable. His phone buzzed with a text from Gerald Hutchins. "Henderson sentencing next month. Usual arrangement?" Caldwell typed back, "Maximum sentence. Consider it done." He pocketed his phone and returned to his steak, satisfied. 20 years on the federal bench, and he'd built a reputation as a judge who wasn't afraid to deliver harsh sentences. A judge who understood that certain types of people needed firm correction. Tomorrow, he would sentence Isaiah Carter to 15 years in federal prison. Another criminal off the streets. Another victory for justice. He had no idea that tomorrow would be the last day of his career. In his apartment, Deputy Marshal James Whitfield stared at a formal complaint form on his laptop screen. He'd typed and deleted the text 5 times. Each time he tried to find the courage to report what he'd witnessed. Caldwell's parking garage meeting with the lobbyist, the pattern of harsh sentences, the systematic bias. Finally, he saved the document without submitting it. Maybe after he retired. Maybe when he had nothing left to lose. He closed his laptop and went to bed, knowing he wouldn't sleep.
As midnight approached, Isaiah allowed himself one moment of vulnerability. He stood at his window, looking out at the Washington skyline, thinking of his mother. "Tomorrow, Mom. Tomorrow we change something." His phone buzzed one last time. Victoria Cross. All teams in position. SAC units standing by. You've done everything right. Now finish it. Isaiah lay down on his cheap mattress, still fully dressed. In his dreams, his mother told him, "Baby, sometimes you have to walk through fire to burn down what's wrong." He woke before dawn, ready to walk through fire one last time. The courtroom filled earlier than usual. Aisha Kamal's preliminary article had drawn attention. Journalists, legal observers, and civil rights advocates packed the gallery. Word had spread that something significant was happening in courtroom 6. Thomas Watkins returned, determined to witness what he suspected would be a miscarriage of justice. He'd seen this pattern too many times, but something made him come back anyway. Maybe hope, maybe stubbornness, maybe the civil rights advocate in him that refused to look away from injustice. Isaiah entered in handcuffs, unnecessary for a defendant who'd been out on his own recognizance, but Caldwell had ordered it. The symbolism was clear. Humiliation as part of the punishment before punishment was even pronounced. Marcus Holloway looked haggard, defeated. Monica Reeves appeared confident, victorious. Diane Chen positioned herself at her stenography machine with careful precision, her fingers poised. Deputy Marshal Whitfield stood by the door, his jaw tight, his eyes troubled. "All rise." Judge Raymond Caldwell entered, his black robe flowing, his expression stern and satisfied. This was his moment, his courtroom, his justice. "Be seated," he commanded. "We'll hear closing arguments, then I'll pronounce sentence." He looked at Monica. "Ms. Reeves." Monica rose, delivering a closing argument so perfect it could have been used in law school textbooks. She summarized the evidence, connected the dots, painted Isaiah as a calculating criminal who deserved the maximum sentence. Several observers later admitted they briefly forgot this was about a real person's freedom.
Your Honor, Monica concluded, the United States recommends the maximum sentence of 15 years in federal prison. The defendant showed no remorse, offered no cooperation, and represents a danger to the community if released. Thank you, Ms. Reeves. Caldwell turned to Marcus with barely concealed contempt. Mr. Holloway, I assume you have some attempt at a closing argument? Marcus stood, shuffling papers nervously. Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence. Of course he does. They all maintain their innocence. Get to the point, Mr. Holloway, or sit down. Marcus stumbled through his closing, deliberately mispronouncing precedent as president 3 times. Snickers rippled through the gallery. Even Sullivan winced. Mr. Holloway, Caldwell said when Marcus finished, that was possibly the worst closing argument in the history of federal jurisprudence. You should have stayed in whatever night school law program produced you. Sit down before you embarrass yourself further. Marcus sat, his face red with manufactured humiliation. Caldwell leaned back in his chair, surveying the courtroom like a king viewing his subjects. I've reviewed the evidence carefully, and the defendant's guilt is beyond question. He paused for effect. Mr. Carter, please stand. Isaiah rose slowly, his handcuffs clinking softly. His face remained neutral, but something in his posture suggested unbreakable dignity. Do you have anything to say before I pronounce sentence? Isaiah met Caldwell's eyes directly. Your Honor, I have faith in the justice system. I believe that truth always emerges, no matter how long it takes. I believe that those who abuse power will ultimately face accountability. And I believe that this courtroom, this moment, will be remembered as a testament to the principle that no one is above the law. The words hung in the air. Something in Isaiah's tone,
calm, eloquent, prophetic, made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably. This didn't sound like a desperate defendant. This sounded like something else entirely. Caldwell's eyes narrowed briefly, but he dismissed the feeling. Eloquent words from a common criminal. Let me tell you what I believe, Mr. Carter. I believe you represent everything wrong with your community. Entitlement without merit, criminality without conscience, disrespect for authority and law. Sullivan passed another urgent note to Caldwell. The judge crumpled it without reading. This court finds you guilty on all counts. The evidence is overwhelming, your conduct reprehensible, and your attitude unreformed. Caldwell picked up his gavel, savoring the moment. This court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison. Diane Chen's fingers stilled on her keyboard. Her screen displayed a single coded phrase, "Standing by." And I want everyone in this courtroom to see what happens when people like you try to cheat the system. You came into this court thinking you could talk your way out of justice. You thought your smooth words and fake dignity would... The courtroom's rear doors burst open with a metallic crash that echoed through the chamber like a thunderclap. Caldwell stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. Heavy footsteps advanced down the center aisle, purposeful and authoritative. Special Agent in charge, Victoria Cross, strode forward, flanked by 6 FBI agents in tactical gear. Their badges hung on chains around their necks, gleaming under the courtroom lights. "What is the meaning of this?" Caldwell demanded, but his voice carried uncertainty now, not authority. Victoria stopped 10 feet from the bench. Her presence filled the courtroom, commanding, implacable, final. United States District Judge Raymond Caldwell, you are under arrest for corruption, bribery, civil rights violations under federal statute, and conspiracy to defraud the United States of America. The courtroom exploded into chaos, gasps, shouting, people standing, journalists scrambling for phones. Caldwell's face went from red to white in seconds. "I am a federal judge. You cannot identify yourself immediately." Victoria produced her credentials, holding them high. Special Agent in charge, Victoria Cross, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have a warrant for your arrest, signed by Chief Judge Patricia Morrison. Then Isaiah Carter slowly stood from the defense table, his posture transformed completely. No longer submissive, no longer defeated, his shoulders straightened, his chin lifted, his entire presence shifted from defendant to authority figure. "Allow me to introduce myself properly, Your Honor." Isaiah's voice had changed. Gone was the careful, respectful tone. In its place was quiet power, absolute authority. The voice of someone accustomed to command. "I'm Isaiah Carter, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and you, Judge Caldwell, have just been recorded committing multiple federal felonies." The courtroom fell into absolute shocked silence. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before the courtroom erupted into chaos. Caldwell's face went from red to white to purple. "This is entrapment! This whole trial was a setup!" His hands gripped the bench so hard his knuckles went white. "I am a federal judge. You cannot arrest me in my own courtroom." "Actually, Your Honor, we can and we are," Victoria Cross said, her voice calm and deadly. She gestured to the agents flanking her. "You've been under federal investigation for 3 years. Everything you said and did in this trial has been recorded as evidence."
Monica Reeves stood at the prosecution table, reaching into her briefcase. She pulled out her FBI credentials and held them high. Special Agent Monica Reeves, FBI Public Corruption Unit. Your Honor, I've been documenting your communications with prison industry lobbyists for 18 months. Marcus Holloway rose from the defense table, his nervous demeanor evaporating completely. His posture straightened, his voice lost its uncertain quaver. Special Agent Marcus Holloway, FBI Undercover Operations. He produced his badge. "Every objection I failed to make, every cross-examination I bungled, all calculated to give you confidence to reveal your true nature."
Caldwell's eyes darted around the courtroom, seeking support, finding none. His gaze landed on Diane Chen, the quiet court reporter who'd sat silently through 2 days of proceedings. Diane looked up from her stenography machine, meeting his eyes for the first time. Senior Forensic Analyst Diane Chen, FBI Financial Crimes Division. Her voice was stronger than anyone had heard before. Every word of this trial has been recorded and preserved as evidence, including your admission of predetermined judgment before hearing closing arguments. Robert Sullivan dropped his pen, his hand flying to his mouth. Everything he'd witnessed suddenly made sense. The inconsistent bank records, the too perfect evidence, the defendant's inexplicable dignity under systematic humiliation. "Oh my God," Sullivan whispered. Aisha Kamal stood in the gallery, her phone already recording. Her journalistic instincts had been right. Something was wrong with this case, but not in the way she'd imagined. She began narrating quietly into her phone. "Breaking news from the federal courthouse. Judge Raymond Caldwell has just been arrested by the FBI in a dramatic sting operation." Thomas Watkins rose to his feet, tears streaming down his face. He began to clap, slowly at first, then with increasing intensity. Others in the gallery joined him. Defendants who'd been victimized by Caldwell's bias, family members who'd watched loved ones receive unjust sentences, legal observers who suspected corruption but couldn't prove it. The applause swelled through the courtroom like a wave. Deputy Marshal Whitfield stood frozen by the door, his hand hovering near his weapon. Victoria Cross turned to him, her expression understanding but firm. "Marshal Whitfield, I need you to stand down. This is a federal law enforcement action authorized by Chief Judge Morrison." Whitfield looked at Caldwell, then at the FBI agents, then at Isaiah Carter, no, Director Carter, standing at the defense table with absolute authority radiating from him. "Show me the warrant," Whitfield said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Victoria approached him, presenting a sealed document. Whitfield read it carefully. His eyes widened as he absorbed the scope. Charges of corruption, bribery, civil rights violations, conspiracy, all supported by a federal judge's signature authorizing Caldwell's arrest. Whitfield lowered his weapon and stepped aside. "Warrant is valid," he said quietly. Then, even more quietly, "Thank you." Caldwell was making demands now, his voice shrill with panic. "I want my lawyer. This is illegal. You manufactured evidence. You entrapped me." Isaiah walked around the defense table, moving with the authority of his true position. He approached the bench, slowly, deliberately, letting Caldwell see him clearly for the first time. "Judge Caldwell, let me explain something to you. For 2 days, you systematically humiliated me based on the color of my skin. You mocked my intelligence, questioned my education, and treated me like I was less than human." He held up his FBI credentials again. "I graduated top of my class from Georgetown Law. I served as assistant director of the FBI's Criminal Investigative Division before being appointed director. I've dedicated my life to rooting out corruption and protecting civil rights." He paused, letting that sink in. "And you judged me guilty the moment you saw my photograph." Caldwell's mouth opened and closed, but no words emerged. "Special Agent Cross," Isaiah said, turning to Victoria, "please proceed with the arrest." 2 agents moved forward with handcuffs. Caldwell tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. His judicial robe, symbol of his authority for 20 years, suddenly seemed like a costume, a disguise for the criminal he'd always been. "No," Caldwell whispered, "this can't be happening. I'm a federal judge. I have immunity. I have friends in high places. This can't—" "Your friends in high places are currently being interviewed by federal agents. Gerald Hutchins and 5 other prison industry lobbyists were arrested an hour ago. We have recordings of every bribe, every payoff, every corrupt communication." She turned to address the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this investigation has documented 23 separate instances of bribery, 47 cases where Judge Caldwell dismissed prosecutorial misconduct against defendants of color, and systematic sentencing disparities that violated federal civil rights statutes." Isaiah picked up a folder from the defense table. We also have evidence that your sentencing decisions generated over $8 million in profit for private prison corporations that paid you kickbacks." He opened the folder, displaying financial records. $2.3 million over 8 years, Judge Caldwell. That's what you sold justice for. Caldwell's knees buckled slightly. The agents supported him, keeping him upright. "Escort the prisoner to the holding cell," Victoria ordered. "Process him for transfer to the Metropolitan Correctional Center." As the agents began leading Caldwell toward the side door, he turned back one last time, his voice breaking. "This was entrapment. The trial was fake. You manufactured a crime." Isaiah met his eyes with cold precision. "We didn't manufacture anything, Judge Caldwell. The embezzlement case was fiction, yes, but your corruption, your bias, your systematic abuse of power, that was all real. That was all you." The agents led Caldwell through the door. His black robe disappeared from view, leaving only the echo of his protests fading down the hallway. The courtroom remained in stunned silence until Thomas Watkins spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd see this day. Never thought I'd see a judge face justice." Isaiah turned to Thomas, recognition crossing his face. "Mr. Watkins, your case is dismissed with prejudice, and the FBI will be recommending that all charges be dropped permanently." Thomas wiped his eyes, overwhelmed. "Thank you. Thank you." "No," Isaiah said quietly. "Thank you for speaking up, for refusing to accept injustice as normal." The courtroom transformed into a federal crime scene within minutes. FBI agents cordoned off areas, photographed evidence, and began interviewing witnesses. The chaos of revelation gave way to the methodical work of documentation. Isaiah remained at the defense table, now clearly in command. Monica and Marcus stood beside him, the 3 undercover agents finally able to drop their masks completely. The relief on Monica's face was visible. 2 days of verbally attacking her boss had taken a psychological toll. "Director Carter, permission to speak freely," she said quietly. "Always, Monica. That was the hardest thing I've ever done. Prosecuting you, watching Caldwell abuse you, maintaining cover while—" Her voice caught. "I'm sorry for every word." Isaiah placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did exactly what needed to be done. Without your performance, Caldwell wouldn't have felt confident enough to reveal his true nature." He looked at Marcus. "Both of you were brilliant." Marcus managed a weak smile. Playing an incompetent lawyer was harder than playing a mob enforcer. At least mobsters don't care about legal precedent. Despite everything, several people laughed. The tension broke slightly. Victoria Cross approached with her tablet. "Director, we need to address the room. People have questions." Isaiah nodded and moved to the center of the courtroom. The gallery quieted immediately, all eyes on him. "Ladies and gentlemen, I owe you all an explanation." His voice carried clearly through the space. "For 3 years, the FBI has been investigating systemic corruption in federal sentencing. Judge Raymond Caldwell was identified as the primary target of this investigation." He gestured to Monica and Marcus. "The trial you witnessed was entirely fabricated. I committed no fraud, no embezzlement occurred. The entire case was constructed to give Judge Caldwell an opportunity to demonstrate his pattern of bias and corruption in a controlled environment." Ayesha Kamal raised her hand. "Director Carter, can you explain the legal basis for this operation?" "The operation was authorized by the Department of Justice and overseen by the Chief Judge of this district. Every aspect was reviewed for constitutional compliance. We did not entrap Judge Caldwell. We simply created circumstances where his existing corruption could be documented." "But wasn't the trial itself a fraud?" Ayesha pressed. "Doesn't that undermine public trust in the courts?" Isaiah paused, considering the question carefully. "That's a fair concern, but consider this. Judge Caldwell's corruption had been undermining public trust in the courts for 8 years. His victims didn't get fake trials, they got real convictions based on his real bias.
This operation was designed to expose and end that corruption. Robert Sullivan stood from his seat beside the bench. His face was pale, his hands trembling. Director Carter, I'm Judge Caldwell's clerk. I witnessed his behavior for 6 months. I kept notes about his inappropriate comments. I noticed inconsistencies in the evidence. His voice strengthened. But I didn't report anything. I was too afraid for my career. Victoria approached him. Mr. Sullivan, we've been aware of your notes for some time. We've also monitored your private research into judicial misconduct. Your documentation will be crucial evidence in the prosecution. Sullivan was shocked. You knew about my notes? We've had surveillance on Caldwell's chambers for 18 months. Your notes were some of the most valuable corroboration of his pattern of behavior. Victoria's expression softened slightly. Mr. Sullivan, you're not under investigation. You're a witness who found the courage to document wrongdoing, even if you weren't ready to report it yet. I should have reported it immediately, Sullivan said, shame evident in his voice. I should have. You're reporting it now, Isaiah interrupted, and that takes courage. The system that protected Caldwell made it dangerous for people like you to speak up. That system needs to change.
Marshal Whitfield approached Isaiah with a rigid stance. Director Carter, I need to confess something. He inhaled deeply. Yesterday, I saw Judge Caldwell in the parking garage. He met with a man and they exchanged an envelope. I didn't report it because he hesitated, ashamed, because I was afraid. Gerald Hutchins, Victoria confirmed, a lobbyist for the prison industry. Surveillance caught it. The envelope had $25,000, payment for ensuring harsher sentences. Whitfield looked crushed. I could have stopped this. Isaiah's voice was firm. Marshal Whitfield, your testimony is critical. As an impartial witness, you'll help make sure Caldwell never sits on the bench again. Thomas Watkins, dignified despite his years, stepped forward. Director Carter, I'm Thomas Watkins, civil rights activist in the 60s. Thought I'd seen it all. He shook his head in disbelief. Never thought I'd see justice like this. Isaiah shook his hand. Mr. Watkins, your courage, speaking out even while facing charges, matters. Silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Thomas asked softly, my case? Dismissed, Isaiah assured, and the U.S. attorney won't pursue the federal charges. You grew marijuana for your wife's pain. That's compassion, not a crime. Tears welled in Thomas's eyes. She died 3 months ago. She never got to see. Isaiah placed a hand on his shoulder. She saw you fight for her. That's the legacy that remains. Aisha kept recording. Director Carter, can you tell us about your mother? Isaiah's face shifted, grief laced with resolve. My mother, Lorraine Carter, spent 30 years here as a public defender. She fought for those who couldn't afford lawyers. She watched judges like Caldwell discriminate against her clients. The system broke her. It killed her at 53. His voice grew thick. This operation was for her, to finally hold that system accountable. The courtroom grew silent. Even the agents paused to listen. She used to tell me, baby, sometimes you have to walk through fire to burn down what's wrong. For 18 months, I walked through fire. I lived a false identity. I missed my daughter's birthdays. I endured Caldwell's abuse, and I do it all again because some fires are necessary. Monica stepped forward gently. Director Carter, your first call should be to your family. Isaiah pulled out his real phone, dialed a memorized number. Sarah, it's over. I'm coming home. 2 weeks later, Isaiah stood before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senators from both parties watched intently. It was the first time an FBI director had testified about going undercover against a sitting federal judge. Director Carter, this operation was unprecedented. Some call it brilliant, others reckless. Why take this approach? Isaiah leaned into the mic. Senator, going undercover was my choice. Caldwell's corruption ran deep. 23 bribes, 47 misconduct cases buried, hundreds of defendants harmed by racial bias. The traditional methods failed. Judges protect each other. The system shields its own. He showed sentencing data. For 8 years, black defendants in Caldwell's court received sentences averaging 3.7 years longer than white defendants for the same crimes. The odds of this happening by chance? 1 in 10 million. Senator Crawford pressed, "But Director, you let yourself be humiliated. Some say you created the injustice you sought to stop." Isaiah's reply was steady. The injustice already existed. Caldwell had been humiliating black defendants for years. When he humiliated me, it was documented. Every slur, every abuse. That's the difference. My humiliation lasted 2 days and ended with Caldwell in cuffs. I'd call that justice. Senator Rodriguez spoke next. "We hear this triggered a review of Caldwell's cases. What's the outcome?" Isaiah nodded. "So far, we've reviewed 127 convictions, 43 overturned, 68 on appeal, and at least 23 shown to have harsher sentences solely due to race." He paused, letting that sink in. "That's 23 families destroyed. 23 lives derailed, hundreds of years of combined prison time, based on racial bias, not evidence." The hearing room fell silent. "The prison industry lobbyists who bribed Caldwell?" Isaiah continued. "Gerald Hutchins and 4 others have been indicted for racketeering. We've documented their payments to 3 other federal judges who are now under investigation. This operation didn't just catch one corrupt judge. It exposed a system of corruption." Back in Washington, D.C., the media coverage was intense. Aisha Kamal's article had gone viral. Her detailed account of the courtroom drama viewed millions of times. She'd won 3 journalism awards in 2 weeks. But more importantly, she'd sparked a national conversation. Her follow-up piece examined both sides of the controversy. Legal ethicists praised the FBI's commitment to exposing corruption. Civil libertarians worried about the precedent of manufactured trials. Constitutional scholars debated whether the ends justified the means. Aisha presented all perspectives fairly, but her conclusion was clear. When the system protects corruption, sometimes you have to work outside the system to fix it. At a community forum in Southeast D.C., Thomas Watkins addressed a crowd of over 500 people. The elderly activist had become an unexpected spokesperson for criminal justice reform. "I'm 72 years old," Thomas said, his voice carrying through the packed church. "I've been fighting injustice since the 1960s. I've marched with Dr. King. I've been arrested more times than I can count, and I never thought I'd live to see a federal judge face real accountability." The crowd erupted in applause. "But here's what matters. It took an FBI director going undercover for 18 months to catch one corrupt judge. One judge, folks. How many others are out there? How many more victims will there be before we reform this system?" At a legal ethics nonprofit in Virginia, Robert Sullivan addressed a room full of new law clerks. He had left the federal judiciary, unable to stomach the knowledge of his complicity, and found purpose teaching others to be braver than he'd been. "I watched Judge Caldwell abuse his power for 6 months. I documented it in my notes. I researched judicial misconduct, and I did nothing because I was afraid for my career." His voice carried genuine remorse. 43 people are having their convictions overturned because of what Caldwell did. 43 people I could have helped if I'd found the courage to speak up sooner." He looked at the young attorneys before him. "You're about to clerk for federal judges. Some will be brilliant legal minds. Some will be fair and just. And some will be corrupt. When you see corruption, you have a choice. Protect your career or protect justice. I chose my career, and I'll regret that choice for the rest of my life." Several clerks wiped their eyes. Sullivan's candor was powerful precisely because it acknowledged failure, not just success. At FBI headquarters, Monica Reeves sat in her office reviewing case files. She'd been promoted to assistant director of the Public Corruption Unit, but the psychological toll of the operation lingered. She'd started therapy to process the experience of verbally destroying an innocent man for 2 days, even knowing it was theater. Her brother Jerome called weekly to check on her. He understood better than most what it cost to fight the system. He'd served 6 years for a crime he didn't commit before DNA evidence freed him. "Monica," Jerome said during their last call, "what you did mattered. You helped expose corruption that destroyed lives like mine." "I know," Monica replied, "but knowing it mattered doesn't make it easier to live with what I said to Isaiah, the words I used, the contempt I performed so convincingly." "Did Isaiah forgive you?" "He said there was nothing to forgive, that I was doing my job." "Then you need to forgive yourself, because you saved dozens of people from what happened to me." In a modest home in Maryland, Thomas Carter sat at his kitchen table with his wife Sarah and daughters Keisha and Imani. 18 months of absence had strained their relationships, but family therapy was slowly rebuilding trust. "Daddy," Imani asked, "was it scary when the bad judge was mean to you?" Isaiah considered how to answer honestly without traumatizing his daughter. "Yes, sweetheart, it was scary. But I remembered that Grandma Lorraine fought against bad judges her whole life. I was fighting for her." "Did you win?" Keisha, age 11, was old enough to understand more complexity. "We won something important. We stopped one bad judge and helped change laws so other bad judges will be caught faster." He paused. "But the real winning will take years. Changing systems takes time." Sarah squeezed his hand. She'd been furious when she learned the truth about his 18-month absence. Furious that he had lied. Furious that he'd chosen this mission over his family. But she was also proud. The man she'd married believed in justice deeply enough to sacrifice everything for it. "I'm glad it's over," Sarah said quietly. "I'm glad you're home." "So am I," Isaiah replied. "So am I." But even as he spoke, his phone buzzed with updates. 3 more federal judges under investigation. A task force being formed to examine sentencing disparities nationwide. Congressional hearings on judicial reform. Legislation being drafted to close the loopholes that had protected Caldwell. The work wasn't over. It was just beginning. 6 months after the arrest, Isaiah Carter stood in the back of a federal courtroom, not as a defendant this time, but as a witness. Judge Raymond Caldwell's criminal trial had lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. 23 counts of bribery, 47 counts of civil rights violations, conspiracy to defraud the United States. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Caldwell sat motionless as the verdict was read, his expensive suit unable to disguise the broken man wearing it. His attorney had argued entrapment, manufactured evidence, violation of due process. The jury rejected every argument. The evidence spoke for itself: recordings, financial records, victim testimony, and the damning footage of Caldwell's systematic abuse during Isaiah's trial. "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Patricia Morrison said from the bench, the chief judge who had authorized the FBI operation, "You have betrayed the trust placed in you by the American people. You sold justice for profit. You targeted defendants based on race. You systematically violated the civil rights of hundreds of people who appeared before you." Caldwell's hands trembled in his lap. "This court sentences you to 20 years in federal prison." 20 years. The same length of sentence Caldwell had given dozens of black defendants for far lesser crimes. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Isaiah watched from the gallery as Caldwell was led away. He felt no satisfaction in the man's destruction, only relief that the corruption had ended. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring no one else got hurt. 3 months later, President Martinez stood in the White House Rose Garden announcing the Judicial Accountability and Reform Act. Isaiah stood behind her, along with Monica Reeves, Thomas Watkins, and Robert Sullivan. The legislation represented months of negotiation, but it would fundamentally change how judicial misconduct was investigated. For too long, President Martinez said, "We've operated under the assumption that judges police themselves." The Caldwell case proved that assumption wrong. This legislation creates independent review boards, mandatory reporting requirements, and robust oversight mechanisms to ensure that judicial corruption faces swift accountability. The law passed both houses of Congress with bipartisan support. Some reforms were symbolic, others were substantial, but the message was clear: judges were not above the law. At FBI headquarters, a new division opened, Operation Integrity, a dedicated unit to investigate judicial and prosecutorial corruption nationwide. Monica Reeves led the team, bringing the same meticulous attention to detail that had documented Caldwell's crimes. "We've received over 300 complaints in the first month," Monica told Isaiah during a briefing. "Judges accepting bribes, prosecutors hiding evidence, systematic bias. The Caldwell case opened floodgates." Isaiah reviewed the reports, each one representing a potential victim of corruption. "Investigate every credible complaint. We send a message: abuse your authority, face consequences." The Supreme Court issued its ruling on Caldwell's appeal 3 weeks later. In a unanimous decision, they refused to hear the case, letting the conviction stand. Justice Elena Vasquez wrote a concurring opinion that legal scholars would study for decades. When those sworn to uphold justice become instruments of injustice, extraordinary measures may be required to expose their corruption. The FBI's operation, while unprecedented, was constitutional, necessary, and served the public interest. The precedent was set. Future operations targeting judicial corruption would have legal foundation. In prisons across the country, defendants began receiving letters. 87 convictions from Caldwell's court had been overturned or sentences reduced, families reunited, lives restored. Men and women who'd lost years to a corrupt judge's bias finally saw justice. Marcus Williams would have been among them if he'd lived. The 19-year-old who hanged himself after 6 months of a 15-year sentence couldn't be brought back, but his family received a formal apology from the Department of Justice and a settlement that acknowledged the system's failure. His mother, Diane Williams, became an advocate for wrongly convicted defendants, working with Thomas Watkins' Legal Aid Fund to help others navigate the system that had failed her son. A documentary premiered on Netflix, The Director's Gambit: How One Man Went Undercover to Expose Judicial Corruption. It featured interviews with Isaiah, the undercover team, and Caldwell's victims. The footage of Caldwell's arrest, the moment his face transformed from arrogant authority to panicked recognition, became one of the most watched clips in documentary history. The film sparked thousands of conversations about systemic racism, judicial bias, and the costs of fighting corruption. Robert Sullivan's TED Talk, Complicity and Courage, What I Learned as a Corrupt Judge's Clerk, went viral. Over 10 million views. Law schools made it required viewing. His message resonated. Silence in the face of wrongdoing is itself a form of wrongdoing. Sullivan now taught legal ethics at Georgetown, Isaiah's alma mater. He trained future attorneys to recognize corruption and find the courage to report it, using his own failure as a cautionary tale.
Deputy Marshal James Whitfield retired after 30 years of service. His testimony about witnessing Caldwell's bribery meeting had been crucial evidence. In retirement, he became a consultant for criminal justice reform organizations, finally using his voice to advocate for change. On a cool October morning, Isaiah visited Rock Creek Cemetery. He walked through fallen leaves to a modest grave marked Lorraine Carter, 1970-2023, public defender, fighter for justice. He knelt beside the headstone, placing fresh flowers. "We did it, Mom," he said quietly. "Caldwell got 20 years. 87 people got their freedom or reduced sentences. Congress passed reform legislation. We changed something." The wind rustled through the cemetery trees. "I know you'd tell me the work isn't done, that there are more corrupt judges, more broken systems, more people who need help." Isaiah smiled. "You always said justice was a marathon, not a sprint." He stood, brushing leaves from his pants. "I miss you every day. But I understand now why you fought so hard, why you gave everything to defend people nobody else would defend. Because someone has to stand in the gap. Someone has to say, 'Not on my watch.'" His phone buzzed. "Victoria Cross. Director, we have 3 new cases that need your review. Possible judicial corruption in Boston, Miami, and Seattle." Isaiah looked at his mother's grave one more time. "The work continues, Mom, just like you taught me." He walked back to his car, already reviewing the case files on his phone. Sarah and the girls were waiting at home. He'd promised them Sunday dinner, no work interruptions. He learned to balance the mission with the life that made the mission worthwhile. The foundation for change had been laid. Caldwell's conviction sent a message to every corrupt judge in America: you are not untouchable. The system can be reformed. Justice can prevail. But Isaiah knew the truth his mother had understood. Real change required constant vigilance. Every generation had to fight corruption anew. Every system needed people willing to walk through fire to burn down what was wrong. As he drove out of the cemetery, Isaiah thought about the future. His daughters would grow up in a justice system slightly more just than the one that killed their grandmother. Not perfect, not even close, but better. And sometimes, better was enough to keep fighting for. The final image, Isaiah pulling into his driveway, where Sarah and his daughters waited on the porch. He put away his phone, set aside the case files, and walked toward his family. The FBI director becoming simply a father, a husband, a man who'd sacrificed everything and gained the knowledge that sacrifice mattered. Because in the end, justice wasn't about one dramatic arrest or one corrupt judge's downfall. Justice was about the daily choice to do what was right, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Lorraine Carter had understood that. She'd taught her son well. And now, Isaiah Carter would pass that lesson forward to his daughters, to his agents, to a nation still learning that the fight for justice never truly ends. It just finds new warriors willing to carry the torch. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.